So about a year and a half ago, I released a video where I talked about my top 10 science fiction books. And looking back on that, I like the list. I think they're all still pretty good books, but I would make some serious changes even a year and a half later. So today I thought it'd be fun to revise that list, revisit some of those selections, and talk about it with you. You know, it might seem a little silly to want to post another video like this, 15, 18 months later, but I think a couple of things have happened. One, I have read a lot of new science fiction, some of which I think needs to be on this list. Two, I've actually revisited some old works and changed my assessment of them. Some of them have gone up a lot higher, and some of them have even been removed from this list. And three, whenever you're making a list like this, to be completely honest, you're just speaking from where you are at that particular time. And it's really hard to predict how your tastes are going to subtly change over the course of, say, a year and a half, a couple of years. And that's why it's fun to go back and look these over every once in a while. By the way, I do talk about spoilers at least a little bit in this video. I personally don't care about spoilers, but people get angry. So I'm just going to tell you, you will hear about plot points or important themes in books because I'm discussing why I like the books. So let's talk about some books that are no longer on my top 10 list. The first one is going to be The Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis. That was number 10 on my old list. Now, here's the main reason why I have taken C.S. Lewis off of my top 10. I think that C.S. Lewis, with the exception of maybe one or two works of fiction, is a really pedantic writer. And I realized I was being inconsistent in my assessment of him versus how I feel about other really pedantic science fiction writers. So one of my major criticisms of the way that science fiction is written today, a lot of science fiction that's coming out now, it's also true for fantasy, it's that writers don't trust their audiences. They don't trust their audiences to be able to figure out that even if the bad guy is not explicitly condemned and have a character basically speak directly to the reader and say, by the way, that guy is awful. It's like they don't trust us to be able to make our own moral judgments, and they have to make everything too crystal clear. And I actually find it condescending when other authors do it. And I realized actually that probably C.S. Lewis is guilty of that more than most writers. And once I realized that, as I looked back at the Space Trilogy, despite the fact that I still really like the second book, Paralandra, I just think that I had to change my assessment of it. I had to remove this from my top 10, definitely. The second big change is that I've removed the 3-body problem from my list. And the main reason for that is that I have had really good discussions with other, mostly actually YouTubers who talk about science fiction, and they've pointed out enough of its flaws that when I started to think about it more and even revisit it, I found myself enjoying it a lot less. And I think that really speaks to the way that discussions of books actually can impact your initial assessment. It had been a while since I had read it when I put it on my list because I remember really enjoying it, but I've read a lot more science fiction in that time. I've read a lot more fiction. I've started thinking more about books and everything else, and just my opinion of the work changed, and almost universally it was downgraded. Since those two were very explicitly removed, I thought I would talk about them up front. But let's actually just get into the list. Number 10 on my list is Dune. Dune was a lot higher in my original list. It was sort of right in the middle of my old video. And I've moved it down just because there were other books that I definitely wanted to bring up and talk about on the list, and I thought I enjoyed more and that I think more highly of higher up. And the main reason I would say that I've lowered Dune on the list is that I think that the first book is really good, but if you're understanding it as sort of setting up a larger story, the story just doesn't hold up nearly as well. I think those first 3 books are a really nice, cohesive story, but as we progress further, the story just doesn't hold up as much in a way that actually kind of makes you go and reinterpret the original book. It's not that they're bad, it's just that they don't really kind of live up to the brilliance that you kind of originally perceive in Dune. But that being said, it's still number 10. It's still in my top 10 list. And one of the main reasons I think that I love it so much is because it's about the dangers of prophecy. It's about a kind of religious fervor. The book, I think, handles those themes significantly better than the films. I liked the 2 Dune films, the Villeneuve films, but I think that the book just does such a better job of exploring those themes and their complexity and their sincerity on the parts of characters. One of my biggest criticisms of the second Dune film was actually the way that they portrayed the religious Fremen as like fundamentalists who were almost mocked by other characters in a way that I think just doesn't capture the actual sincerity of their belief and provides more of a psychological motivation for some of the things that they're able to accomplish, but also, as we see in those later books, some of the horrors that they are able to perpetuate. But the thing that really has continued to stand out to me as a brilliant part of Dune is that world building. And I'm a big fan of just feeling like I'm in a world which actually exists. I think by drawing on so many different influences from our world and then just weaving on this kind of complex mytho-history for the universe, Herbert is able to make you feel like you are part of something really huge, this tremendous and awesome. Number 9 is a book that I read last year. I actually read it in the hospital while my wife and son were resting after my son was born. And that's The City in the City by China Miéville. Now, this book introduced me to Miéville's work. I had never read him, and I think that, like, for some reason, he has these terrible book covers. And I know that book covers don't tell you everything about a book, but when you're looking at a bookstore and you just see, I think, these often very bland and generic book covers, well, they just don't draw you in. And for some reason, I assumed that Miéville was going to be a bland and generic writer. So The City in the City was my introduction to him, and it proved to me that he is anything but bland and generic. The funny thing about putting this on the list as opposed to some of his other work is, which I've now read a couple of his books in the last year, it's that The City in the City is by far his most normal book, and it's still really weird. It's about 2 cities which are like superimposed on top of each other. So you sort of exist in both of them, but residents have to make sure that they're only existing in their city and not crossing over into another one. And if they do, they're said to be in breach. And there's a kind of secret police force that will keep them, that will punish them and take them away. And it's a source of real mystery in the book for a very long time. But the main character is a police officer trying to solve a murder, and he has to eventually cross over to the other city. He can do so through legal and restricted means, but still he has to deal with the fact that he's moving into a place where his entire life he's been told to basically pretend like it doesn't exist. It's got this great influence of like post-Cold War, post-Soviet bloc, Eastern European influence. You see a lot of Miéville's politics coming in through that choice of influence. But I love the vibe of the book. That's the easy way to say this. The cities themselves are almost their own kind of characters in the book. And while I don't really care that much about a murder plot, I'm not really a murder mystery kind of, or a detective fiction kind of reader. It's a nice, like, motivating story to just get you to explore all of these complexities. Now, you might wonder, if you're familiar with Miéville, why am I not talking about like Perdido Street Station or a book that I read and love, The Last Days of New Paris? With The Last Days of New Paris, I think the answer is that that's a very interesting and weird and cool book. I just didn't enjoy it as much. Perdido Street Station is part of this larger saga. It's like a trilogy, I believe, and I haven't finished the trilogy, so I don't want to put any of those in a ranking yet, even though I think that Perdido Street Station and the Boslog books are probably kind of Miéville's best. But there's also just something personal about The City in the City, because when you discover a new favorite author, and Miéville has become a new favorite author for me, not the favorite, but definitely one of my favorite living authors. When you discover a book by a new favorite author, you're just going to love that book that introduces you to the author. And so for me, that's going to be The City in the City. Now, before we go to number 8, let me tell you about something called Magic Mind. Magic Mind is this kind of performance drink that you can drink for mental clarity. They recently reached out to me and asked if I wanted to try their product before I decided if they were going to sponsor this video, which, by the way, they're sponsoring this video. And I said, yes, I liked this approach. I liked that they actually let me try the product and see how I felt before actually asking me to sign a contract. So they challenged me to try Magic Mind for 7 days and to see what kind of benefits that I would get out of it. One of the big things that I'd been focusing on was actually getting better sleep. I've been struggling a lot with my sleep lately, and I thought that one of the reasons was that I was drinking too much caffeine. It actually turns out the founder of Magic Mind had a similar problem for health reasons. He needed to stop drinking so much caffeine, so he started developing Magic Mind. Because it uses ingredients like matcha, it can give you that energy boost. And so you can feel really good throughout the day, but you're not going to get the same kind of jitters that you would get if you were drinking so much coffee. And that's definitely what I saw. When I drank this for 7 days, I found that I felt basically as good as I did when I was drinking a lot more coffee. I found that it was easier for me to fall asleep and to stay asleep. And I didn't have any of those weird side effects you get sometimes if you just drink way too much coffee, which I definitely was doing before. And this probably isn't the most important thing about a drink like this, but I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that it tasted pretty good. I expected this to taste pretty bad, but no, it's pretty tasty. So if you go to the link down below, which is magicmind.com/JaredH, and you use the code JaredH, you're gonna get a pretty nice deal from Magic Mind. You can get 48% off your first subscription purchase or 20% off a one-time purchase. So check out that link down below, use the code JaredH, and try out Magic Mind. All right, so number 7 is still the Earthseed books. This is Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. When these books were written, they were near future climate apocalypse. We are actually living in the time frame described by those books. So if you were ever thinking about reading them, now's a pretty good time to, just because, you're going to read about stuff that was happening in the 2020s. A lot of people, when they talk about why they like Earthseed so much, they like to talk about its political relevance. And that is clearly a huge part of the plot. But I've always really liked to focus on the sort of psychological interior reality of Butler's characters. It's what I think she does really well, including in Lilith's Brood. It's just one of her genuine strengths as a writer. And what makes this science fiction as well is that the main character has this kind of power, but also this, some would say, illness or disability, where she can feel the pain experienced by others. And as I've thought more and more about Earthseed, I've realized that that's a really important character trait for the main character, because Earthseed, in a lot of ways, is about the harm that we inflict on each other. It's not just about the political harms or the harms that a political system and a sort of religious nationalism inflicts on the main character and her friends, but also the harms that she inflicts. Eventually we transition to hearing about her daughter and her daughter's perspective. And we see the ways in which we harm people throughout our lives. And it ends up being a series about healing and being able to move on despite the pain or despite the things that we have endured. A lot of science fiction gets so caught up in ideas that it leaves out the discussion of the human element. The best science fiction doesn't do that. And Butler is a great example of a science fiction writer who never forgets that fundamentally these stories are still about us. It's still about human beings. And so whatever crazy premise you have, it still needs to somehow relate to our experiences today. It's actually reminiscent of a line from my favorite science fiction writer, Ursula K. Le Guin, where science fiction is not about predicting the future. It's about sort of excavating or really describing the present. And so it's fitting that Butler is right in front of the first pick from Ursula K. Le Guin. That's number 7, and that is The Left Hand of Darkness. The Left Hand of Darkness is arguably Ursula K. Le Guin's most famous work, other than maybe A Wizard of Earthseed, because that is pretty popular, especially amongst younger readers. But when it comes to science fiction, I think most people think of A Left Hand of Darkness. And The Left Hand of Darkness is fundamentally about what we used to sometimes call the gender wars or the sex wars, the division between man and woman. And Le Guin expertly tries to explore this problem by imagining a world where there is no sexual differentiation. I think sometimes people like to say it's a world without gender, and it is a world without gender roles. That is absolutely true. But importantly, there's that physical, biological aspect about it too. The people of this world she imagines, which the main character who's visiting calls it winter, but it's called Gethin, they are naturally sort of hermaphroditic. And then about once a month, they are ready to have sex in some fashion. And they might take on the male role or the female role, but they don't know which one. And it could kind of go at random. And what will happen is that when they pair, just one of them naturally takes on one role, one takes on another for that period of time. So what you end up having is a world where there is no male or female, either in a biological sense, except for a limited period of time, or in a sort of metaphysical sense of a gender identity. Nothing like that. And Le Guin tries to see how all of this would impact the people of Gethin, about how their society would be different if there was no difference in the sexes. The people of Gethin never invented war, but they're also kind of middling when it comes to industry. Le Guin is always critical. She always has a point of view, but she is also honest in her writing. And I would say she's not pedantic in a way that I've criticized other science fiction writers for being. So even though there's a clear point of view being expressed, you're sort of left to do the intellectual work to think through all of the implications. And The Left Hand of Darkness resonates with readers so much because I think of that skill that you see on the page. And while it's not my favorite Le Guin, that's going to be number one. If you watch this channel, you know what book it is. But I still think that The Left Hand of Darkness is so good, it has to be in a top 10 for me. And there's a reason that it's sort of almost like a culturally defining science fiction book. Number 6 on my list is A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller. Now, this used to be a lot higher on my list. I think it was closer to 3, maybe 4. It's moved down just because I've reconfigured things, but it's one of those books that I revisited lately and I reread. And here are the things that I still love about this book that I think warrant it being so high on my list. One, I think that the structure, telling a story in 3 sort of epochs of human development after recovering from a great disaster, is powerful and interesting, and it just works really, really well. I wish more science fiction writers would consider doing that. So in a way, it's a multiple point of view book because there's 3 main characters, one for each of the sections, but it's also limited to a single point of view. And as I look through my favorite science fiction works, and this is probably true for my fantasy works too, but a little less so, I really like single point of view books. I like books that will explore just one character's experience of the world. Now, we get that 3 different times in this book, and you'll see something like that in another book in a little bit. But as we tell each individual story, we're just seeing it from one individual's perspective. I think that works really well. I think books that hop around point of views often feel a little lazy. It's become a standard these days in a lot of genre fiction. And I think that more people should challenge themselves and not do this. They should try to write from either a more strictly a single point of view, or they might even try what Herbert does in Dune and try third-person omniscient, which is something that almost no genre fiction writers are doing these days. The reason I have moved it down a little bit is that I find that each of the 3 stories drags just a little more than I remembered. And I found that the 3rd story, despite having a great ending and being the right way to end, is probably less compelling throughout than the first 2 stories. So the first 2, as we're sort of in these phases of rebuilding, are very powerful, and pretty much I'm engaged the entire time. In the 3rd story of the book, we're really seeing humanity commit a lot of the same mistakes that led to, well, the very first story, actually. We're seeing nuclear war happen again, worldwide destruction happening again. And a lot of it, though, kind of feels like the main character rushing around, going one place, talking to someone, going somewhere else, talking to someone, in a way that just feels less narratively compelling and shows a little bit less craft on Miller's part. That said, one of the strong themes is about the preservation of knowledge and the sort of triumph of the human spirit in the face of extreme adversity. These are themes that I love to see in books. These are themes that I think work so well in science fiction, as we'll see with some other books too. And so I'm just in love with the book. It's just not quite as high as I used to think. Now, number 5 is, I'm just going to say a whole series here, which feels a little bit like cheating, especially when you consider how many books are in it. But I think that they cohesively form something much bigger than any individual books. And that's The Culture by Ian M. Banks. Previously, I'd just had Player of Games, and I only had Player of Games at the time because I had read that, and then I'd read Consider Phlebas, and I didn't love Consider Phlebas. A lot of people have told me to read all of The Culture and then go back and read Consider Phlebas. And in hindsight, I think that's the right thing to do. Consider Phlebas, though, is just so different from the rest of The Culture. The book, though, that convinced me that this series needed to be considered as a whole, and it needed to be higher up on my list, or pretty high up on my list, was reading Use of Weapons. Use of Weapons plays with form in a really beautiful way, telling two stories going in different directions in time. It is personally it's very humanizing. It's a quite human book, even though in The Culture, almost no one is actually just human. It has thrills to it, but those thrills are often grounded. It doesn't read like it's just a page turner. Yes, there are action scenes. They're limited enough, though. I mean, for a book called Use of Weapons, weapons are not the most important thing in the book. And instead, I think actually kind of similar to Earthseed, it's a book about healing, but sometimes actually about the inability to heal when something you've done is so wrong. It has one of the strongest endings to a science fiction book that I've ever read. Just absolutely heartbreaking. And I think this is where you see, kind of like with Player of Games, which I still love, I still think is excellent. And I'm only mentioning Use of Weapons so much because it was the one that really sold me on The Culture. But Use of Weapons is philosophically sophisticated. It's narratively quite tight, despite having this kind of weird experimental form. And then I just think that it shows a kind of precision on Banks's part. And I love writers that can be really precise and they say just the right words. I'm not saying minimalist. I like writers who can also really express themselves when they need to. But in The Culture, especially in Use of Weapons, you kind of see that every word's doing a job. And that makes for just a terrific reading experience, whether that's science fiction, literary fiction, philosophy, whatever. That's just craft. That's just skill. So, all right, next up is Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. In many ways, Book of the New Sun is like the opposite of The Culture. 4 books, 5 if you include Earth of the New Sun, which is worth reading. But it's meandering, it's weird, it goes all over the place. It reads like you're in a dream. Some people find it boring, some people find it mystifying, some people treat it like a puzzle. But I think actually one of the best descriptions of Book of the New Sun actually is a different writer talking about a different book. Hear me out for a second. When William Gibson was describing Samuel Delany's Dahlgren, he says that Dahlgren is basically like a code we're not meant to crack or a puzzle we're not meant to solve. I'd have to look up the exact line. And that's kind of how I feel about Book of the New Sun. There are hints all over the place of what it might be like, of like the truth. There are hints all over the place of like what the truth is underneath the story. Where on Earth literally is Severian? Where is the action taking place? Lots of people have speculated it's like closer to like Rio de Janeiro or something. What is the actual history of this world? What are the mechanics of all of the science fiction-y kind of fantasy stuff going on? But I find myself kind of uninterested in all of those. I find when I read these books, when I read Wolfe, I'm just swept away. There's something about like being in that dreamlike state when I read him that I find to be the most enchanting, the most thrilling, honestly. Wolfe wears his religious influences on his sleeve, and yet I don't think it's pedantic in the way that I would say it is like with Lewis. And sort of being anti-pedantic is kind of my big thing right now. Actually just letting the reader kind of understand things on its own. Obviously with Severian, you get huge amounts of kind of Christ figure symbolism, but you see that in all kinds of fiction. You see that all over the place. And it becomes much more explicit only very late in the last book, in a way, though, that I think is rather fitting because the ending is apocalyptic. Apocalyptic in the sense that the mysteries are being revealed. And so Severian sort of comes into himself as well. It's hard to describe this book to someone who's never read it. So all I could say is, if you're watching this and that sounds at all appealing, you should just go read it. Just go read Book of the New Sun. All right, we are in our top 3. And the third book is a book that didn't make it on my top 10 last year, even though I read it years ago. And it's just because I had forgotten how much I loved it. But then I had a friend, my friend Jimmy, read this book on my recommendation, and he talked about it so much that I wanted to revisit it. And when I did that, I realized that this book is a masterpiece. And that's Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. David Mitchell, along with China Miéville, I think is just one of the greats, one of the great living, working writers right now in science fiction. Mitchell is not always put in the science fiction section of the bookstore or the library, often classified just with general fiction or literary fiction, but he always plays with these weird elements, just like Miéville does. And I think if that's not science fiction, then we're just being elitist, and we're basically saying that if you get good enough, you're not science fiction anymore. And I think with Mitchell, though he's clearly writing science fiction, Cloud Atlas is a sequence of stories where you read the first half of the first story, the first half of the second story, the first half of the third story. You go all the way until you read that final inner story. And then you read that all the way through. And then, you start reading the back half of all of those other stories in reverse order. So it's like stories within stories within stories within stories. You finally get to enjoy one all the way through. And then you start sort of reversing the sequence that got you there. I mean, this is Mitchell channeling Calvino in a lot of ways, but Mitchell just playing with form in a way that has actually become a small theme in this as well. I mentioned use of weapons plays with form quite a bit as well. And I always like it when an author can do that while still writing a compelling story. Well, because this is one thing I think you have to keep in mind when people want to talk about playing with form or being experimental. You can play with form all you want. You can be experimental, but if you end up taking away from the story, if your experiment in form makes it a less pleasant read, then you have failed. Then you have failed as a writer. Mitchell does not fail as a writer. One thing that I love when I talk to people about this book is finding out what their favorite story is. For me, it's probably Sluicious Crossing, but there are so many varieties, and they play with genre as well, that I feel like I learned something about people. In fact, like my buddy Jimmy, who loved the book, his favorite story is probably my least favorite story. And I think that's really funny. Even though we both love this book and we both rank it really high in our list of science fiction books, I actually think for Jimmy, it's like near the top of his books of like all time, which makes me feel very good because I told him to read it. But still, I mean, I just love seeing how this work has so much variety and diversity within it, and yet is still a cohesive whole, that people can love it, but they can love such different parts of it and still walk away like sharing that mutual love. What a masterpiece. Mitchell basically deserves all the praise that he can get. This top 2, honestly, I don't know if it's ever going to be displaced when I talk about science fiction. Number 2, though, is Anathem, or Anathem, depending on who you talk to, by Neal Stephenson. This is philosophical science fiction. I like to talk about philosophical science fiction a lot. And if you look through this list, you see a lot of these novels are big idea novels. This is a big idea novel. This is a novel that is fundamentally about the debate in philosophy, in medieval philosophy, between nominalism and realism. What a stupid idea for a novel, you might say. How could you possibly make this interesting? Well, combine this with cloistered monks who have gone through something almost reminiscent of a Butlerian jihad or something that you would see from Dune. Add to it and here's a big spoiler warning for a second, so let's pause. All right, add to it a multiverse story. Do such complex world building that it takes about 100 pages for you to understand what's going on, and then it just all kind of clicks and everything they say makes sense. Add all of that together, and you just have a terrific work of science fiction. Neal Stephenson, I think, is one of the most versatile writers writing today. His Baroque cycle, totally different than Anathem. Snow Crash, totally different than both of those books. He's like a chameleon. But one of the things that stands out is that Stephenson always knows where his prose need to go in order to serve the story. And in Anathem, I just think he hits that perfect balance. And I would say it's probably Stevenson's best structured novel. It's convoluted in ways, but it has that plot. You can follow the plot. It resolves nicely. which is not always true of Stevenson novels. Like Seven Eves just kind of ends. It ends, it just doesn't have an ending. Anathem isn't like that. Number one for me, the best science fiction book of all time, the book that will never be displaced, is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. Why do I love this book so much? One, a little bit of an experiment in form, basically two timelines, single POV, same character, but two different timelines. And so in a way, the book ends where it begins, in a way that's very satisfying given the rest of the themes of the book. Integration of theories about relativity or about physics and time in really philosophical kinds of ways. A really compelling main character, Shevek, based on Oppenheimer, actually, who Ursula K. Le Guin met because her father was a famous anthropologist who happened to meet a lot of intellectuals at the time. And so Le Guin actually bases Shevek on Oppenheimer, but also an exploration of anarchist ideas. This is not the bomb-throwing kind of anarchism. This is a non-violent sort of anarchism. And Le Guin explicitly wanted to see if you could write a utopian novel about non-violent anarchism. She then made it an ambiguous utopia, which I just think speaks to her honesty. A philosophy that she loved, that she tried to pursue in her own life, she had to still make it ambiguous because she had to be honest. She contrasts Anaris, the anarchist world, with Eurus, a world of statist, whether capitalist statist or socialist statist, but still statist, as Shevek calls them, a world of archist, because they're not anarchist. And you have to see the good and the bad of all of these different systems. But fundamentally, it comes to Shevek believes in something, even when social pressure is against him, even when the world has really turned against him, even when he knows that what he's going to do is going to lead to a lot of upheaval. If he knows that it's right, he's going to pursue it. I actually think there's a lot of similarities with Le Guin herself. Le Guin is a woman who I admire deeply. She is like a personal hero of mine. And so then to see someone like Shevek on the page and to have just read it at the right time just made me realize science fiction can be political, it can be politically relevant, it can be interesting and provocative, and it can be really good while you do those things. It's very easy to write a political novel. It's very hard to write a good political novel. It's very easy to try and write a philosophical novel. It's very hard to write a good philosophical novel. And to do that with science fiction, or non-mimetic fiction, as Le Guin might have wanted to call it, just shows how wonderful she is as a writer. I think because of me, some other people, even on YouTube, have started to read this book. Reactions have been mixed. And I think, though, I understand why some people wouldn't love this book as much. I don't totally understand why some people don't like it. I think at least it's sort of meets the formal qualities of a good book, but I can understand why they don't love it like I do. It speaks directly to my soul, basically. I love this novel. I basically am reading it almost once a year at this point. Probably read it in another 6 months. And I always feel like I'm learning something new or getting something new out of it. I just think it's brilliant. And that's what great science fiction can be. All right, folks, this was a long video, but it was fun. I would love to hear how your tastes have changed over the last year and a half or so, or just to hear about your favorite science fiction books down below. I look forward to talking to you, and I'll see you soon.